London, 1965, Giacometti is in London to oversee the hang of his big exhibition at the Tate. He has been aware of Bacon and his work for some time, but the two men have grown closer because they have several friends in common. The writer, Michel Leiris, the critic, David Sylvester, and above all, the artist's model, Isabel Rawsthorne, a striking beauty with whom Giacometti had an anguished and possibly unconsummated affair. Both artists have made memorable portraits of her. Bacon himself has had a retrospective show at the Tate a couple of years earlier, and since the exhibition travelled to several European museums, he is becoming a name to reckon with both at home and abroad. Still, 8 years younger than Giacometti, he is considerably well known than the Swiss-born sculptor, whose prodigious talents are admired throughout the international art world. Giacometti, however, is already in poor health and will die the following year. Isabel has organised a couple of dinners in London for Giacometti and Bacon to get to know each other better. Bacon has long admired Giacometti's work, especially his drawings, which he believes are more concentrated and evocative than his sculptures. Struck though he is by the force of Bacon's images, Giacometti's remains unconvinced by the English painter's practice of attacking the canvas without preparatory drawing, since he himself draws constantly, every day, and makes it the base of everything he creates. Despite these reservations, the two artists form an immediately cordial rapport. While Giacometti speaks a fluent or, if strongly accented, French, Bacon's grasp of the language is good enough to converse on any subject. Both men love to talk, pulling apart ideas and reconceiving them as they go on. This evening, they have enjoyed a lavish dinner at Wheeler's Fish Restaurant, then go on to the Colony Room, Bacon's favourite drinking club in Soho, to pursue their freely flowing conversation about life, art, and their mutual friends. After a while, the club starts emptying, but the two artists, sensing that they may never have another occasion to talk, order more champagne.
Is it true, Francis, that when you raise your glass, you always say, champagne for my real friends and real pain for my sham friends?
That's just an old Edwardian toast people used to do. But since I spend so much time drifting from bar to bar and person to person, I do say from time to time, it seems to sum up these situations so clearly. And after all, Alberto, what else is there to do in life but to sum up the situation clearly?
Yes, of course, that's the only point of anything, and certainly the only point of art, no? I think the aim is to create a kind of residue of reality, not to reproduce reality as such, which is impossible, but to create a reality of equal intensity, its essence, if you like. It's also a way of trying to give existence to some form of permanence. Of course, you never achieve that. However much you try, you always fail, time after time. And you're bound to fail because that intensity is always out of your reach. You might think every now and then that you've got a little closer, so you keep on trying. And here's the contradiction. Nothing would be worse than succeeding, because if you did, there'd be nothing left to do. You know, I love being in London. I don't know why I don't come over more often. And not just to hang a big show like the one at the Tate, or to go and look at those fantastic early Egyptian paintings you have at the British Museum. I am in awe of them because they're so lifelike and real. And London is so completely different from Paris. Everything looks different, even the trees in the parks. And the people, well, they seem to inhabit a different kind of space as they queue so calmly for the bus or make their way along the street. And then these secret little bars and clubs you've taken me to. It's like a different planet.
Well, it's terribly nice of you to say that, Alberto. But I always think Paris is so much more beautiful and stimulating than London. I mean, it often feels terribly provincial and dreary here. And there's really not much happening in the arts. Not much happening in anything, come to that. I remember I always used to see the latest issues of Cahiers d'Art and those things, kinds of magazines, simply to find out what was happening in Paris, what you were doing, what Picasso was doing.
Well, there's your own work, Francis, which I find very exciting and inventive. I went to your gallery yesterday to see the new portraits you've done of your friends, and I have to say that next to your paintings, which radiate vitality, my things at the Tate will look as though they've been done by an old spinster.
Alberto, nothing could give me greater pleasure than to hear you, who I consider to be the greatest living artist, say that about my work. I'm hugely, deeply touched. I've admired everything you do and your whole attitude towards life and art from the beginning. It's not just what you've created, but it's the way you live. I've always struck by those photos of you in your studio, with all its marvellous mess strewn over the floor. I live in that way too, because I find having all that chaos around you stimulates ideas as you work. I've got so many photos and things piled up underfoot that I think of it as my compost heap. And every time I walk up to the canvas, I kick new images up, and they act like triggers for ideas while I'm painting. And all the painters I see regularly in London, like Lucian Freud and Frank Auerbach, look up to you as the great figurative artist of our times. You've been a model for us all. Particularly now, the art world is only interested in abstract art.
Me, a model? I'm no model.
Do you remember, before Isabel introduced us, I saw you sitting at the Fleuret in Saint-Germain. It must have been in the early 50s. And I felt I had to come over and say that for me, you were the greatest living sculptor and draftsman of our times.
And what did I say?
What terrible times we must be living in. Yeah. Ever since I was a child, drawing... But nobody has managed to convey so much about what it feels like to be a human being, now as you have in those marvellous drawings. You managed to sum up so much in a single stroke of the pencil. You even managed to sum up the air, the space and atmosphere surrounding each of the figures you draw. And the figures themselves seem to spun out of the air. It's magical, especially for me, because I can't draw. I've never been able to. I don't know why, and it's always been one of my limitations. The thing is, I have the image I want to do clearly in my mind, but I don't know how I'm going to achieve it. I go straight to the canvas and hope that as I splash the paint down and move it about, and will something to suggest to me how I can achieve these images, that they are dropping into my mind like slides.
Well, it must be wonderful to work like that. I'm not really interested in the process of making the actual object. I'd as soon sketch out an idea and then have someone else, an assistant or an artisan, make it into a sculpture. And I'd be delighted if someone else could also do my painting for me. I just want to see this thing that's in my mind actually produced, then perhaps make a few alterations to it here and there. But I couldn't begin to do anything, whether a painting or a sculpture, without drawing it over and over again until I felt I'd more or less got it down. Ever since I was a child, drawing has always been the basis of everything that I do. I draw to try to understand what I'm looking at. Do you see, to understand the world around me, even though when I'm drawing, I often feel like a man groping his way through the dark. For me, it's the only way I can grasp what's in front of me, even if it's a glass on a table. like this one, or the nose on someone's face. It sounds odd to say that even now I can't really draw a nose, but it's true. When I look at it, when Diego or Annette is sitting there in front of me, their nose just seems to dissolve or to become so enormous and strange, like a pyramid, that I don't even know where to begin. After all these years, I still can't draw a nose.
Well, it may be that my images are often slapdash. They probably are. Even if I do try to make them what's called deeply ordered. I mean, I occasionally do little sketches in thin paint. Before I start on the canvas. But they're only the briefest points of departure. I often have the image I want to do clearly in my mind. But until I begin to work, to get a little paint down and push it around, I've no idea how I'm going to achieve it. That, for me, is the whole mystery of painting, and also its tremendous excitement. What I'm always hoping for is to have this great wave of instinct and make these things come off my nervous system directly and intensely as I can, with all their freshness clinging to them like a foam. It almost never happens like that, of course, but that's another story. You know, I had a dream once. It was ridiculous, as most dreams are, when you recount them. But I had a fish in my hand. And I thought, if only I could slap this fish into the wet plaster on the wall, with all its bones and everything in it, I'd have a perfect painting.
For sure.
After all, I only paint for myself, to excite myself, by trying to trap these images that sometimes just to seem well up in me, one after another.
You can only work for yourself. I mean, my only reason for drawing and so on is because I want to understand the world around me a bit better. I have no idea what other people will make of what I've done. I never think about that. I'm sure that the people who look at or buy my work are interested in it for completely different reasons than me. For one thing, as far as I'm concerned, no work I've ever done is ever finished. I always feel it could be improved or taken further, even if it's already gone into an exhibition or somebody's collection. But for the spectator, it's a completely finished work. And of course, I can't go around the galleries or people's houses telling everyone the piece is actually still unfinished, can I?
Well, that's the thing, Alberto. When one sees one's things later, one is simply never satisfied with what one's done. Although I believe Henry Moore is.
Yeah. I saw a huge reclining figure by Moore the other day. It was like the side of a mountain, and I thought I might be able to do some little figures on it, perhaps a little shepherd or a flock of sheep. Then another difference is that I'm just as interested in the failed and destroyed pieces I've made as the ones that go into exhibitions and private collections, because in a way they're all failures. Some perhaps more than others, but it doesn't matter to me. And this is less contradictory than it sounds. I think of failure as inevitable. And if I ever really succeeded, it will be the worst thing in the world. It will be the end, like death or something even more terrible.
You know, I always aim to make the one greatest image that will cancel out all the others. But you're right. If it happened, it would be a catastrophe, because there would be nothing left to live for. I've always thought that if I didn't have my work, I'd just be a crook or a gambler and drink myself to death. But that single great image won't actually come about, because you can't will these things into being, of course, particularly in my case, because when I'm painting, I leave as much as possible to chance, or what I call accident, which is very important to me. And I don't think about chance or accident could possibly work for me in the way I hope for if I'd done a series of preparatory drawings.
Yes, I can see that.
So I just go on like a fool or a child, in the hope that the first brush stroke will suggest others and so on, and that all these images that the paint itself seems to indicate will go on indicating or engendering some forms and new possibilities. That's what I love about oil paint, because it's so endlessly fluid and suggestive. And sometimes, when things are going badly, I just put a paint stroke right through the image, just like that, to obliterate it. And suddenly, the whole thing comes alive again, and I can see how I might make it work.
Yes, I'd heard about your fascination with chance, Francis, and I know you're a great gambler in life, just as in painting. I don't think so much about chance, though of course it's always good to have chance on your side when you're working. What has always intrigued me enormously is how scale changes everything one sees. Like the little people walking down the opposite side of the street when you're sitting on one of the cafe terraces, and how you convey this dramatic difference when you're drawing or painting or modelling your memories of them. I was going to meet Isabel on Boulevard Saint-Michel one night, and I saw her from far off, silhouetted against a huge doorway in a dark building. She looked so tiny and so vulnerable. I've never forgotten that vision, and when I tried to recreate it, I could have put her on a huge plinth to suggest the sense of scale, but I wanted to stay close to the first sensation I'd had. And as I worked to capture it, my sculptures began to diminish in size. They got smaller and smaller until they crumbled into dust, into nothing.
Yeah. I've always particularly admired your very small sculptures.
Well, in the end, I think the simplest things can be the most memorable. I mean, this glass in front of me, if you look at it in a certain light, it can be the most compelling sight in the world, as magnificent as some palace in India. I could copy it for the rest of my life without ever really penetrating its mystery. Everything for me has mystery. Sometimes I think I could spend the rest of my life drawing the same chair over and over without ever exhausting the subject or even defining it. And then, if you think of someone who poses for you every day, who you try to capture every day, when you see something new, something unforeseen appear on that face, it's like the greatest adventure, the greatest discovery in the world.
Well, you're right. A face can be simply an inexhaustible subject because it's always changing, it's always different.
You know, once, not long after the war, I was watching the news in a cinema in Montparnasse, and all the images on the screen suddenly looked to me like black and white blobs dancing around. I couldn't focus on them. And they lost all interest so far as I was concerned. But then I looked at the people sitting in the seats on either side of me. They seemed incredibly fascinating and present, overwhelming even, like huge presences I hadn't properly noticed before. And so did the trees and the streets when I came out of the cinema onto the Boulevard du Montparnasse. Everything looked new, as if I was seeing the world, discovering it for the first time, as if up until then I had been looking at it through screens.
You've just said a very profound thing, Alberto. In a way, we all live screened existences. And when people complain, as they do, that my paintings are violent, it's merely that I've been able to clear a few of these screens away and show life as it is. After all, you can't be more violent than life itself. People complain about cruelty, about bullfights, as they eat their steaks and lamb cutlets and stand around in fur coats with dead birds in their hair and feathers and things in their hats. It's so mad! After all, we all live off one another. I mean, life itself is so cruel and violent. You only have to open a newspaper to see how cruel everyday life is. All I'm trying to do is to convey a certain reality.
Well, yes, there is violence in everything, in sculpture, in life itself, as you say. When I'm drawing a head, I'm constantly astonished by all the violence it conveys. To live, just to exist, requires such enormous reserves of energy that the whole thing radiates violence. That's understood, but then on top of that, you have to ask yourself what that reality you mentioned is. You might say that if I managed to copy this champagne glass in front of me with its exact shape and the way the light falls on it, that's reality. But even then, you're never actually copying the glass. You're simply copying the residue of its appearance in your eyes as you look at it from every angle, from a distance or from up close. And that itself is always changing because your point of view never stays the same. Sometimes I think I live entirely in my own reality, which is quite separate from anyone else's. And I must try to understand it, to get a grip on it, in order to nourish myself, to protect myself, to survive.
Well, au fond, this is the thing, Alberto. We do what we do to survive. I wouldn't let out the thoughts and feelings I put into my pictures if I didn't have to live. It's only by painting that my life has anything meaning at all. I adore life, even if I think of it as meaningless. After all, from birth to death, we simply drift from nothing to nothing. And I think only by our drives, by our passions and appetites, do we give anything meaning at all to existence.
You talk as if you once believed, perhaps as a child, that life had a meaning, and then you were disappointed when you found out that it didn't. I think I've always remained a child. I think I haven't really changed much since I was a boy of about 12. But somehow, I never expected anything. I was too obsessed with trying to understand what I saw immediately around me to search for any other meaning. But now I really hate it when I'm called an existentialist, as if I belong to some philosophical school. I don't belong to anything. I barely belong to myself. I'm just trying to understand. No? I mean, people talk about existentialism as if it's something completely new and people hadn't lived in doubt and anxiety before. It's ridiculous. People have always lived in doubt and anxiety right through history.
You're absolutely right, Alberto. I actually think most real artists, although of course there are very few real artists, as you know, stay close to their childhood sensations. And I agree that calling you an existentialist is ridiculous and totally misses the point. It's the same thing for me, you know. People keep saying that I'm an expressionist, whatever that means. But I'm not, after all. I've got nothing to express. In fact, I loathe expressionism with all its ghastly, loose puddles of paint. I actually think, if I think about these things at all, that I'm a realist. I'm only trying to make my sensations about life come back to me more strongly and more poignantly.
Realism has become a dirty word these days.
In the end, I've been influenced by absolutely everything. Everything. Because I've looked at everything. And it's all gone in and been ground up in my imagination. I mean, I've looked enormously at Egyptian sculpture and things because I think of them as the greatest art man has ever made. But I've also looked at prehistoric art, at the great masterpieces of the Renaissance, at Rembrandt's extraordinary self-portraits, at Manet, Degas, and of course Van Gogh, and even done a series of Pope after the Velázquez portrait of Pope Innocent X, which I think is perhaps the greatest portrait ever made, even if the things I did do not really work at all. And I have to say I'm a bit ashamed of them now. But you've looked at the whole history of art too, Alberto. One senses the presence of the great masters right through your work.
Of course. Well, how else could one learn or have any idea what to do? You have to acquire some sense of the rules, even if you're going to break them.
Yes, above all, if you're going to break them.
Absolutely. As our writer friend, Michel Leiris, once said, if there are no rules, there is no game. Painting, after all, is a deeply cultured activity. You have to know what's been done before in order to do anything new. Even as a child, because my father was a painter, I was aware of all kinds of art, and I began copying all kinds of things, from Assyrian and Egyptian art to Giotto and Dürer. I must have copied things in the Louvre, 50,000 times. It was like an obsession. And like you, Francis, I also copied that marvellous portrait by Velázquez, because I agree it's one of the finest portraits in the world. But nowadays, the young artists all think that's very passé, that you shouldn't copy it all, but be totally original and reinvent everything, like the surrealists.
Well, people often talk about surrealism in relation to my work too. I don't like being branded a surrealist any more than an expressionist. Even though it's true that when I was a very young man, I spent quite a lot of time in Paris in the 1920s, and surrealism, which was all the rage then, as you know, did open me up to new attitudes and ideas about life as well as art. I think it taught me a lot about the importance of technique, and how technique and subject had to interlock and become completely inseparable. Surrealism probably had all the more effect on me because there was nothing of that kind of intellectual upheaval, with all the challenges to tradition and the desire to renew happening here in London. For somebody who had seen so little in life, having been brought up on a horse breeding farm in Ireland, you can imagine what an impact the whole surrealist thing had on me.
Oh yes, of course.
By the way, how fortunate you are to have people like Michel Leiris and Sartre and Genet writing about your work. We have nobody of that quality writing about art. I'm afraid I always think how marvellous it would be to have someone really tearing into your work and telling you what to do, like Pound when he cut and edited the Eliot poem.
Well, Leiris is a very old friend, of course, but he's too modest to make a critique of my work. Perhaps that's why we've stayed good friends. Sartre wouldn't think twice about it, but then I don't think he has much of an eye. However clever he is with ideas, with concepts, he can't actually see a painting. Genet, on the other hand, has a real sense of what I'm trying to do, and I think his book about my studio is unusually perceptive. Anyway, the surrealists certainly dominated the early part of my life in Paris. I got caught up with them in the late 1920s, and like you, I'd come from a very different background. Well, imagine going straight from an isolated village in the Swiss mountains to the inner circles of Montparnasse in its heyday. Most of the surrealists were about my age and very bright and charming, full of crazy ideas about how everything could be changed and reinvented. And I liked a lot of them personally, not just the painters like Ernst and Miro, but the writers as well, Éluard, Ravel, even Breton for a time. I was actually best man at his wedding, you know. And through them, I got to know a whole side of Paris, collectors, decorators, dealers, society people that I probably wouldn't have come across otherwise. Well, that helped me a great deal because one of the decorators, Jean-Michel Franck, asked me to do decorative objects for his clients, which meant that my brother Diego and I managed to earn some money to pay our way.
Yeah, I didn't know you worked as a decorator. And what's more, by far the best decorator in Paris. That's very curious. Because when I started out, I did something similar. Not for somebody as accomplished as Frank, of course, but I did design some carpets and chairs and things. But they're all very derivative. And now I wish I hadn't done anything of that kind. I'm sure your decorative things were much better. Still, as you say, they do help one to keep going at the time.
Well, so since I was in contact with the surrealists the whole time, I absorbed a lot of their ideas, and I started doing a completely new kind of sculpture full of wild fantasies and sly references. I was showing off, proving that I could do things that were just as weird and perhaps even weirder than anything the others had done. And this went on for several years until I eventually realised I'd been on the wrong path and none of it was making any sense. And it was no more than masturbation. And I needed to get back to working from life, from a model. Of course, Breton didn't like that at all. Anybody can draw a head, he said. And one day he and some of the others lured me into a meeting and formally kicked me out of the movement. The Pope of Surrealism excommunicated me. I also lost quite a few good friends when I left, which I regretted, but in a sense, it was the best thing that could have happened to me.
Well, it must have been marvellous to have known all those people and gone around with them. For some reason, I hardly ever seem to meet people I can really talk to. I suppose it's partly because I find so many of what's called intellectuals so boring. And then, with my sort of gilded gutter life, going from bar to bar, person to person, I rarely meet really intelligent people. I meet drunks mostly and people who are in despair. I'd love to meet someone who dominated me, both mentally and physically. A sort of Nietzsche of the football team. But I'm afraid to say that's very rare. Now, I'm not saying that my new friend, George, is the Nietzsche of the football team, but he does have the kind of physique, the kind of muscular male voluptuousness that I love to paint.
I liked George very much, even though I'm afraid we couldn't communicate very much when you brought him to dinner the other evening.
I'm so glad you like him. I've become very fond of him. I only wish he would learn something, because as you know, he used to earn his living by breaking into people's houses and things and stealing, but unfortunately, he was always getting caught. So he spent a good bit of time in prison. The thing is, as an East Ender, he was born into stealing. It was like a tradition, because it's what the whole family did. I'm trying to make him get out of that life, because the next time he's caught, he'll do a real long stretch in jail. Since George is very good with his hands, I tried to get him to learn a trade like gilding, which I believe earns quite good money. But naturally, he prefers going out and getting drunk instead. That sounds a bit mad coming from an old drunk like me, but even when I've been on the drink for days, I always know I have to work. Even with a bad hangover, which sometimes actually makes my mind crackle with electricity and helps me to concentrate. But now that I give him money, he doesn't know what to do with himself. I even tried to get him to learn French, but of course that was a total washout.
Well, send him to me in Paris, Francis. I will get him speaking French, and my brother Diego will find him some work to do, perhaps making stands for sculpture. Well, it'd be a pleasure to help George. Well, perhaps I've fallen for him like you, Francis. Do you know, when I'm in London, I always feel homosexual. You must take me some time to what you call your queer clubs. I like to see what goes on there. I love places where people go for sex because they have a special atmosphere. We had the famous Sphinx Club in Paris, where I often went at the end of the evening because I knew quite a few of the girls there, and I could simply sit there and watch them, which I loved, and make drawings of them because they had this extraordinary presence as they stood around there like these incredible goddesses. They were perfectly happy if we brought them a few drinks. And even if you wanted something more than that, you just paid them what they asked for, and they didn't care whether you managed to do it or not. And that was the end of it. They didn't start clinging to you, as women often do afterwards. My life with Annette has become much easier, much freer, now that she has an apartment of her own and lovers of her own. I think I told you about this girlfriend I have called Caroline, who comes to my studio to sit for me regularly, and she's a marvellous model for me. Annette knows about her, and she's not at all pleased, I'm afraid, even though I actually encourage her to have her own lovers. So I do what I can to make sure the two of them never come into contact. But last night, Caroline just turned up out of the blue at the little hotel Annette and I are staying at near Victoria Station. She's gone away again now as quickly as she came, and I don't even know why she made the trip. She's just like that. She comes and she goes, and you don't know why.
Lovers do get very possessive. Yeah, I used to know a man called Peter Lacey. I painted him a great deal at one point. He'd had his nerves shattered from being a Spitfire pilot during the war. And he used to make the most impossible scenes, beating me up and destroying my work. He'd go mad at times and go breaking all the furniture. We were on a long boat trip once, and he thought I was making eyes at one of the stewards, who are always queer, of course, in that kind of luxury boats. So Peter got into a rage and pushed all my clothes out of the porthole, and I had nothing left, not even a pair of shorts. But there it was. I became obsessed with him, and I couldn't live without him. We had these 3 years of absolute hell together. And then, when that exhibition of mine opened at the Tate, among the telegrams came to congratulate me, I got one that's saying he just died in Tangiers. But it was a kind of suicide. He set out to do it by drinking so many bottles of whiskey a day that his pancreas simply exploded.
It is true that falling in love can get you into terrible situations. Caroline has all these connections with the underworld in Paris, and some of the people she deals with are real gangsters. I was in a bar with a young poet friend not long ago when these men Caroline knows came in with guns, and everybody in the place ducked under the tables, and then they shot all the bottles and the mirrors in the bar to pieces. I think they were giving someone a warning. It was very impressive. Anyway, I always give her protectors, or whatever they are, all the money they ask for, and then they leave us alone, at least for a while. You know, I was really happy to see Isabel again at dinner this evening. Francis, she still fascinates me, and I've never met any other woman like her. She's a wonderful friend, and we just seem to pick up at the point where we left off last time we met at the Coupole in Paris. She was also a wonderful model for me, even though I felt quite intimidated by her reputation as a man-eater, which I know has been well earned.
Well, a woman-eater as well, if her affair with Balfour's wife is anything to go by it. Isabel has this extraordinary vitality. She's sort of omnivorous, whether it's for people or drink or God knows what else. People tend to think of women as dainty, you know. But Isabel is much tougher than most men I've known. But then, of course, once you get to know most of them, most men, they're weak, unfortunately.
We're all weak, Francis. Man is a kind of aberration, especially if you compare him to something like the trees that are all around us. Recently, I've been drawing trees for a book about Paris, a book called Paris Without End that Tréhard wants to publish. And I'm struck by how self-contained and majestic they are. I only need to see one tree. That's quite enough. Already 2 trees are too much. So now I would never take a walk in the forest because it would be too much, too overwhelming. Just as I wouldn't want to see more than one glass. One glass already poses too many problems. What is comforting anyway is that trees don't need any answers because they have no questions about their existence. They simply are. We'd all be better off as trees, really.
Well, I'm not sure I'd actually want to be a tree. You know, whenever I'm surrounded by trees and what's called nature, with all these things singing outside your window in the morning, I can't stand it. I just long to get back to the city with the streets and people. Just to walk along the streets and see people going about their daily round. I loathe the countryside.
I do understand, and I've noticed that most of your paintings and portraits are inside four walls. But so am mine. It's true, and even if I do draw or paint the occasional landscape, I'm only really at home in cities too. I used to walk round Paris late at night with Sam Beckett, usually after we'd drunk a few whiskies in bars like Chez Adrien or the Rosebud, and we were going down past the Montparnasse cemetery once, and he suddenly cried out, "I can't look at trees any longer." And I said to him, "That's because you love them so much, Sam."
Yeah, I often wonder about Beckett, Alberto. I mean, I know he's meant to be so profound about man's condition and so on. But I've never really seen the point of all those tramps sitting around in dustbins on the stage, talking endlessly. I've seen plenty of those down and outs around the bars and places in Soho. So I don't actually want to go to see them in the theatre.
I did a very bare plaster tree for a production of Beckett's Waiting for Godot at the Odeon a few years ago. I don't think it worked. I don't think Beckett thought it really worked either. But like me, he accepts failure. He accepts everything that we do, however hard we work at it, is bound to fail. Fail again, he says somewhere. Fail better. I think that's where he's clear-sighted and profound. And I don't know how it sounds in English, but in French, he writes very well.
Well, of course. We do fail. We always fall short. What makes me come back to the canvas time and time again, even though I feel I've done nothing but one failure after another, is the idea that I might do the one perfect image that cancels out all the others. I have this absurd optimism that one day I will achieve that, even though I know it's an impossibility to do.
But I think you have come very close, Francis. Some of your new portraits, those of George, for instance, that I saw yesterday, are stronger than anything I've ever seen in years. They carry a freshness and a vigour that no one else in our time has achieved. And somehow, by constructing those kinds of cages around your figures, you make them doubly vivid and powerful. You are the greatest living artist.
You can't say that, Alberto. Of course, I'm hugely touched. But it's you whom I'm admired, who's been like a god to me over the years, not only in your absolute search for the truth and the whole vision you've created, but the way you've lived, completely dedicated to what you do, whatever happens. It's no surprises that your cages you mention come from you. I know that, even though I've looked at everything and everything has its influence on me. I've always found the cages terribly useful as a space framed for concentrating attention on the central image. It also helps create perspective, which has always been a problem for me when I'm trying to organize the space in my pictures. But this only goes to show it's you who by far and away the greatest living artist. I don't even compare.
No, I have to say it once more, I want to be quite clear, it's you, Francis, who's the greatest living artist.
Alberto, it's always been you. You are.
Oh, what was it, Francis? Champagne for my real friends?